Hi guys, I'm Omayma Mohamed, and I'm really honoured to be speaking about this topic because I find the topic of leaving the left really fascinating, because the process of shedding that leftist identity is the closest thing the secular world has to a crisis of faith. As the Islamic world is going through a process of challenging theocratic control and challenging what it means to be a Muslim and what the Muslim identity means, the Western secular system is facing its own reckoning, with an increasing number of people choosing to abandon their parties on both the left and the right for the centre, and choosing political homelessness rather than the tribalist insanity that we're seeing on both sides. As an ex-Muslim, I've had a taste of both worlds and am struck by the similarities between them. I renounced Islam just over 3 years ago and vowed to make the most of the new choices and freedoms available to me. I vowed to prioritise reason and critical thinking and never let an ideology dictate the concepts of right and wrong for me ever again. Yet, I found myself down the far left rabbit hole just over 2.5 years later. I was pretty distraught to realise that I'd essentially traded one cult for another and just couldn't understand how I'd left myself susceptible to the left's own brand of indoctrination. This frustration and confusion culminated at a feminist event at the end of March featuring Christina Hoff Sommers and Roxane Gay. Up until that point, I'd only reluctantly acknowledged the disturbing characteristics of the leftist movement, such as conformity, censorship, and militant activism that alienated people more than it embraced them. At first, I tried to hold on to the illusion that these were necessary measures to achieve the systemic change required to build a better world. When that failed, I tried to shift the blame onto few radicals that misrepresented the broader movement, particularly with social media's capacity to show you a concentrated political view and maybe distort your perception of what's really out there. So the event, when I finally came to the event, I was finally forced to confront the reality of the situation, with the explicit goal of facilitating open dialogue and diversity of thought within a meaningful topic like feminism. It was very clear how far away from that goal we were. So I wasn't actually planning to go into the event very much, because I have written an article on Colette about it called How Intersectionality Betrays the World's Muslim Women. But just to provide a quick context of what happened there, basically, Christina Hoff Sommers is a liberal feminist that does feminism on her own terms. She doesn't really fit into any particular category. She's a free agent and discusses ideas as they appeal to her or make sense to her, while Roxane Gay sort of fits the classic lefty profile and sort of spouts the very typical views, like, you know, believe all women, the Me Too movement, the prioritising lived experiences over evidence, that sort of thing. And prior to the event, Roxane Gay had also classified Christina Hoff Sommers as a white supremacist, and a lot of her fans were claiming that she was a male supremacist, a fraud of a feminist that operates on bad faith, and the list goes on. So I expected some hostility, but I didn't expect the audience to completely shut down the event with their refusal to listen to Christina Hoff Sommers' side of the story. So basically they were booing, stamping their feet, doing anything they could to disrupt that dialogue. And I felt that they were acting on the example provided by Roxane Gay. So I was pretty frustrated and infuriated to see that dialogue wasn't possible, even though they're both liberals, they both share the same values, but because Christina Hoff Sommers didn't follow the left-specific rigid framework of belief, she wasn't given an opportunity to present her views. So, like a typical millennial, I took to Twitter to share my awakening and genuinely expected it to disappear into the Twitter sphere without much recognition. But to my utter surprise, I was inundated with support from people that had shared my experience, shared my frustrations. I was shocked at how many liberals had walked away from the mainstream left and intersectional feminism because they felt like it no longer represented their values. They had realised, just as I was at the time, that they can and should distinguish between liberal values and the regressive direction that the leftist movement was taking. We form a growing group that recognises that the left's obsession with identifying problems rather than solutions and enemies rather than allies is leading them down a path of self-destruction. Ironically, the left has been so fixated on defeating their opposition and setting themselves apart that they're now in many ways indistinguishable. So what was also clear from the messages of solidarity I received is that everyone's process in reaching this conclusion is unique, and my experience is no different. My relationship with the left begins and ends with Islam. So I was raised in a fundamentalist Muslim household that centred on strict adherence to the doctrine. My siblings and I were taught that we were slaves of God, that were put on this earth as a test of obedience and submission. My parents were pretty open about the indoctrination that they were imposing on us, explaining that imposing boundaries at a young age would make the suffocating restrictions the norm later on. The only choice we really got was in the form of an ultimatum: either accept a temporary hell on this earth with endless sacrifices, or an eternal one in the afterlife. Every doubt, question, criticism of Islamic principles was considered blasphemous, and thinking outside the box was an invitation for Satan to lead us astray. I struggled to ignore many problematic aspects of the faith, such as the utter dehumanisation of women, the victimisation of the LGBT community, hostility towards non-Muslims, and brutal punishments for arbitrary transgressions. Yet I'd been conditioned to distrust my own moral compass where it failed to align with the Islamic one. And I was terrified that independent thought would corrupt me. Ironically, it was the left's bizarre allegiance with Islam that bridged the gap between my Islamic world and the secular one. Because the left validated Islam, I felt comfortable enough to let my guard down and consider what they had to offer. What I found was a very enticing alternative to Islam, particularly in feminism. It gave me a framework to identify the inequality and injustice I was seeing. For example, women are indefinitely subjected to a male guardian's full authority and under the guardianship system, and this system was imposed on me until I left Islam at the age of 21. My gender was a significant disadvantage, and I felt like the movement represented my personal struggles. Similarly, sexual liberation and fluidity appealed to me because sexual purity and slut-shaming are methods of policing Muslim women and eroding their autonomy. And the list goes on. At the time, I was inspired by the humanist causes within the leftist movement and found a purpose outside of religion that gave me the courage to leave it behind. Informed by my experience of oppression, I latched onto the progressive values they promoted. I identified with the visions for social progress because I'd seen the consequences of a society that refused to evolve and accept better ideas. But I made a crucial mistake. Rather than engaging with the left as a platform of ideas to be critically analysed and considered on their individual merit, I absorbed the left as a new identity. I thought that leaving Islam behind and embracing ideas on the opposite end of the spectrum instantly made me a free thinker. I didn't appreciate the fact that a free thinker is always reflecting and reevaluating their position. They recognise that ideas are fallible theories that need to be assessed in the real world. And most importantly, they need to be comfortable with the discomfort of having their beliefs challenged. I, on the other hand, swallowed the leftist ideology whole. I trusted that the movement was fighting for the greater good and allowed social justice activists to mould my perception of reality. Even though leftist activism is overtly negative in terms of identifying power structures, oppression, disadvantage, victimhood, there's something intoxicating about being on a perpetual crusade, particularly when it gives you a sense of moral superiority over others. Even though you're not contributing anything tangible to the desired outcome, judging others for the tiniest infractions gives you a sense of purpose. Another factor at play was the lingering effects of indoctrination. As resentful as I was that my values, beliefs, behaviours had been dictated by someone other than me and not by me, I'd gotten dependent on the structure of an all-consuming ideology. Like religion, leftism provides an illusion of control and certainty that gives you a false sense of security. Like with Islam, I was eventually able to see through the facade and reclaim the steering wheel to drive my own life. The turning point for me was my involvement with ex-Muslim activism. For a while, I'd really struggled to confront the reality of my apostasy. I'd been raised to view disbelief as the all-time low of intellect and morality. Deviating from Islam was considered the ultimate failure, and I struggled with the implications of my decision to reject it entirely, including the fallout with my family and the loss of a community. Discovering other ex-Muslims online who were sharing their own journey and opening up about the individual barriers that they'd faced was a game changer. I realised how deluded I was to think I was the only one crazy enough to leave. In actual fact, there were masses of us, many of which are silenced by the stigma of apostasy. The threat of isolation, harassment, violence, or even death keeps many Muslims in the closet. Denied of basic choices their entire lives, ex-Muslims are also denied the freedom to openly express their beliefs if they choose to leave. Considering the extent of human rights abuses that Muslims and ex-Muslims are subjected to, one would assume that leftists would be our most vocal supporters. However, the moment I realised that wokeness makes the left unreceptive to our stories because they're considered Islamophobic, shattered the illusion that it was an infallible moral code. I was then able to look at the overall leftist agenda more critically and acknowledge that in many ways it was no longer progressive. When I left Islam, I knew that I was going to be a work in progress for a while. The thought of rebuilding my life from scratch and shaping my own future was daunting, but that fear represented the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them. Leaving the left encompasses that challenging process, but standing here, sharing that journey with you, is a celebration of the freedom that I sacrificed so much to reclaim. Thank you.
It's important for me to start at where I am now. Because I don't know any of you, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an artist, a curator, and a writer. I've been making art for about 12 years. I use photography, video, and installation, and I make large-scale pieces. And I use art as a methodology to unearth tensions within me, and that art generally traverses the line between the self, the cultural, and the political. It often taps into social and political discourse, especially taboo and controversial topics. And it has at times moved out of the gallery and into the public realm. I've had my art on trams, billboards, I've done public commissions, and it's gone into the mass media. My work is in every major collection in this country, and in the last 12 years I've had 26 solo exhibitions and been in over 60 group exhibitions. I've been shortlisted for 18 art prizes and I've won or placed in 6. I'm currently undertaking a PhD, although I have no intentions of becoming an academic. And my PhD asks how art can contribute to uncomfortable, controversial and taboo topics. Now, as I said, I've never met any of you before, so I'd like you to get to know me a little bit. So this is my husband and I, and we are holding the thing that we love the most in the world, which is coffee. And the reason why we love coffee is because we have a 3- and 5-year-old who are adorable and time-consuming and exhausting. And my life at the moment looks a little bit like this. So it was important for me to give you a picture of where I am now because I need to give you just a little brief history of my life to lay the foundation for my left to right or conservative journey. I was born to an English, Irish and Jewish mother and a father who has Aboriginal heritage, which is Victorian, it's Wadawurrung, from the Kulin Nations. My childhood was spent with my single mother, and I was an only child. My single mother was a heroin addict, a stripper and a prostitute, which meant that my early years were marred by drugs, neglect and abuse. She introduced me to drugs and alcohol when I was 13 years old, and then died of cancer 3 years later when I was 16, leaving me on my own without any financial support or emotional support. By my early 20s, I travelled to London and I was using and dealing drugs. I was down to 42 kilos, overdosing regularly and going into drug-induced psychosis. Eventually, I was caught dealing drugs in nightclubs and I served 2 years in a British jail. This is my ID card. I think I look sweet and innocent. Surprisingly, prison was a transformative place for me. I began to attend church. I had a come to Jesus moment. I began to read the Bible and pray daily. This is also me in prison in London. Within a year of being released, when I was 26, I began studying. I undertook a diploma in applied photography. I finished that and I never went back to that extreme lifestyle. I started making art, having exhibitions, and I quickly found success. All of my early artworks were exploring identity. I was trying to figure out who I was, and I used art as a methodology to explore that. Within 5 years, my work was at the National Gallery of Victoria, it was on trams, exhibitions of mine were having national tours, and I was winning awards. The artistic opportunities rolled in nationally and globally, and I was named as one of Melbourne's top 100 most influential people. I was a successful artist because I made art that touted social justice warrior, left-wing identity politics and intersectional victimhood ideals. I quickly became an SJW queen. I was regularly featured in the press, had the ABC make a documentary on me and my artistic practice, and I was lauded in the left-wing media. I got all the funding I applied for, and I was invited to speak all over the country. One of my earliest works was the one I'm about to show you, and it was by far my greatest social justice warrior work. When I made this, I genuinely believed in what I was portraying. My Aboriginal grandmother had taught me to be proud of my heritage, and I was trying to figure out who I was and where I belonged, but I was doing that through the media lens of identity politics and intersectionality. That's me in the front. That's my father, aunties and cousins standing around me. I'm still surprised they let me do that to them, but they did. They may also be social justice warriors. This particular work got the attention of Andrew Bolt. probably Australia's most prominent right-wing commentator. He's based in Melbourne. And he began to write about me regularly, and he made me the poster child for the opportunistic fair-skinned Aborigine. This was just one of the articles that I was included in. Eventually, I was contacted by a legal firm who asked me if I would like to take legal action against him. 2 years later, I was testifying in federal court against Andrew Bolt and the Herald Sun under a law called the Racial Discrimination Act, the RDA. The RDA is a law that limits speech based on offence and humiliation. At the time, I didn't understand that the law we were using had a higher philosophical and political meaning to it. I didn't realise I was entering into a fight about free speech. I just wanted to defend my character, and I didn't have an understanding of a full range of moral and philosophical ideas. So while I was an SJW queen on the left, I was an opportunistic, fair-skinned Aborigine on the right. But that was all about to change. For the first time since my release from prison, while the court case was progressing and I'm experiencing so much success as an artist, I began to read the Bible and attend church again. And it influenced my practice. I started to make art that reflected my faith. This is about 10 metres long and made out of 20,000 emu feathers. And this was shown at the Queensland Gallery of Modern Art and purchased by them. This is a 30-channel video of people all repeating the mantra, "I forgive you," over and over. So I had work at the National Gallery of Victoria, at the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Australia, at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. This was at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and in the Queensland Gallery of Modern Art, all exploring the Christian faith. This type of work was acceptable in the art world because people could subjectively project their own views onto my work and believe that I was still into identity politics, intersectionality, and being a social justice warrior. But as I read through the Bible repeatedly, I began to view myself, culture, and politics through its lens, particularly the Old Testament. And that sparked the start of a political conversion that I wasn't expecting, which was very uncomfortable, and lurched me from the left to the conservative right. And then in the midst of all this, the Racial Discrimination Act court case result was handed down. We won. Andrew Bolt had been declared a racist, and I was a national SJW hero. So, it was a big, uncomfortable and annoying surprise to me when in my pursuit of Christianity, I was forced to confront all the ways in which I had created myself as the victim. Turns out, I was a virtue-signalling social justice warrior who lived in a victimhood bubble, blaming everyone and everything for all my problems. I never saw myself as the perpetrator, only as the victim, which is fine when you're a child, but not an adult. And I felt justified in all of my bad behaviour. This attitude kept me disempowered. I was so resentful, angry and bitter, always blaming, and to top it off, identity politics and intersectionality supported this with its victimhood hierarchy. It validated it. So many people are being red-pilled across the Western world for many different reasons. PC culture, intolerance, hypocrisy. But for me, becoming a Christian was the driving force behind my political conversion from left to right. There is no victim identity in Christianity. You have to take responsibility for everything you've ever done. So my SJW victimhood status began to unravel. There is no way that I, of all people, given what I'd been through, could have become conservative, appreciating freedoms, tradition, limited government, without Christianity. It was the only thing that could show me that the identity politics victimhood hierarchy that I had bought into was not a trophy status, but a filthy rag, keeping me oppressed and disempowered. More recently, I embarked on a new artistic project. A series of video artworks for YouTube that explore the tensions that arose in me due to my Christian and political conversion. One of the videos I made details my red pill journey. In it, I talk about my Christian conversion underpinning my political shift, how I've come to understand that identity politics is underpinned by victimhood status, and that I no longer want to be defined by these things. I also talk about how I was a part of the Andrew Bolt Racial Discrimination Act case, and that it was instrumental in opening me up to conservative and libertarian ideas, such as free speech and limited government. Well, Andrew Bolt saw this video and he contacted me. And in this way, I came full circle. I apologised to him for taking him to court under the Racial Discrimination Act. I clarified that I may still have taken him to court under defamation laws, but that I was deeply regretful at using the Racial Discrimination Act and having him labelled a racist. I don't believe that he is one at all. He apologised to me as well, and he invited me onto his show, The Bolt Report, where I spoke about how coming to Christianity unravelled my SJW victimhood identity and gave me an appreciation for free speech and limited government, and how regretful I was at playing a huge part in establishing a legal precedence that gives the government an overreach of power, limiting speech based on offence and humiliation. I believe that it is now my responsibility to publicly step out and tear down the structure that I helped to build. And in some ways, this political conversion has cost me more than the Christian conversion. I've lost friends and work through publicly declaring my Christianity. But coming out as a right-wing conservative was the final nail in the coffin. The art world has gone completely silent on me. As soon as I went on the Bolt Report, I was pulled out of an exhibition, and I haven't been invited to be in one since. So I've started a Patreon if anybody's interested. I'm still making artwork. I'm currently making a new artwork out of about 50,000 emu feathers that reads, "Welfare is slavery." So any support you can offer would be hugely welcomed as I support my family. So here I am. As part of my recent YouTube series that I encourage you all to look at on my YouTube channel and share, I took a number of my earlier artworks, such as the blackface portrait, and I've turned them into memes. I did this to remake them, to reflect who I am now. I've been remade, and I want my artwork to be as well. And I'll finish by showing you some of them. I hope that you like them. And finally, thank you very much.
If someone had told me a year ago that I would take a 15-hour flight from Los Angeles to Sydney to not just attend but speak at a Libertarian conference, let me tell you, I would have thought they were insane. Let me provide you a bigger overview of my lefty credibility. That is me. I am the poster child for a progressive Democrat. I hail from the epicenter of leftist American politics, California. And not just California, but specifically Los Angeles, home to the most expensive avocado toasts in all of the land, very expensive lattes, and also dozens and dozens of famous celebrities, including many of your own. Oh yes, we have your Hemsworth brothers, and we are not giving them back. They're mine. I go to Burning Man, I go to the marches, and as John said, I work in Hollywood, I'm a YouTube personality. The point is you get the whole lefty picture, right? All right, now something super strange happened this past January. I went from this to this. What the bloody hell? Let me explain. thanks to YouTube, I discovered a video by a Latina libertarian, very well known in Latin America, Gloria Alvarez. Anyone? Yes, yeah. Give her some love. She'll watch this video later. I saw her videos and I was hooked. 8 hours of a YouTube binge later, I decided to use my mileage points to book a flight to DC to attend something called LibertyCon to watch her speak in person, at which point I was then exposed to Arthur Brooks and David Friedman and all of these amazing libertarian thought leaders, and I was moved. And what I found most compelling was the defense for the capitalism of ideas. Because the worlds that I come from, you only engage in a debate if everybody already agrees. Which isn't a debate, that's an echo chamber. But these people, they liked it when I asked questions. They wanted thoughtful, critical analysis. These were people that wanted to know their blind spots. Do you get that? You are the movement that seeks to know its blind spots. And I think that is the most humane thing we can contribute to modern political discourse. So that is why I am here, to grow this movement by arming you with the tools to inspire ideological migration, including within lefties like me, toward freedom and policies that are rooted in reason. Because increasingly, I believe that it's people like you who understand one very important truth, that the world is a complicated place, so be careful in thinking you understand it. On that note, how do we grow the libertarian movement? First, by understanding the cognitive and social costs of ideological migration, and second, by easing those costs with the one thing that is more persuasive than reason: compassion. More on that later. But right now, let's rewind to the beginning. When does one first develop their worldview? It happens in your 20s. This is when we're first discovering our political philosophies. This is also when we are first discovering Smirnoff Ice. Yes, that is me. So here we are developing our political identity, despite very limited life experience, limited exposure to competing ideas, and terrible taste in alcohol. And then we choose friends that match our politics so that our friends and our politics become self-affirming. And finally, we call that our identity, as immutable as Daenerys Targaryen's claim to the Iron Throne. Yes, they watch Game of Thrones. Most of us never question our identity again because we don't live in a world that rewards this and encourages questioning. In fact, we reward all kinds of other personal evolutions. When a woman changes her hair color, her Facebook goes wild. But when we dare to politically evolve, we don't just not reward it, we punish it, labeling our friends as traitors and our enemies as weak. I have a question regarding your political identity. Do you think that you agree with everything that the person sitting next to you believes in? Yes or no? Absolutely not, right? Okay, next question. Raise your hand if you love someone with whom you substantially disagree politically. Good for you. And by the way, if you didn't raise your hand in every room you walk into, everyone agrees with you, you're in the wrong rooms. Now here's my question. Those loved ones with whom you disagree, why aren't they in this room right now? Because this room is actually proof that we can sustain ideological differences in the same room, in the same conversation. And yet we're all here, these neighbors are here, but why aren't your loved ones here? Labels. The labels that help bond you in here are the same labels that separate you from your loved ones out there. Whether it be Democrat or Republican or conservative, or dare I say libertarian, these labels grossly oversimplify who we are and who they are. They divide us before we have a chance to find our common ground. So here is my suggestion if you want to inspire more ideological migration from people like lefties like me. Don't speak to the label and don't speak from your label. Here's an example of speaking to the label. This is the official post on the Australian Taxpayers Alliance Facebook page announcing me as a speaker, and as you can see, there are some very colorful remarks. Now, I have blocked their names and their identities because this is absolutely not about shaming them. I actually want to use this as an opportunity to teach us something, that these comments were a missed opportunity to seek common ground and convert someone. I know you guys know your libertarian history better than I do. Some of the biggest libertarian leaders started off as socialists first, who were then converted because someone had the audacity to speak to them like a human being and share with them an enlightening point of view. Trolling has never persuaded anyone. Now, let me further break down why reducing someone to their label is so undermining of their potential for ideological migration. This very same member of Lefty Hollywood is also the daughter of a deeply conservative and patriotic family. In fact, these are all images taken from my mother's Facebook page. Let me keep it real. There are probably more Trump supporters in my family than in the entire state of California. And there are definitely more American flags in my mom's living room than in the White House. And now let me take the contradictions of identity even further. These diehard Americans right here are also dispossessed Cuban refugees. Let me give you a little 15-second recap on the last 60 years of Cuban history. Fidel Castro comes in 1959, turns the island into a dictatorship, and it's been a hot mess ever since. That's the end of my recap. So, my family was forced to work in communist labor camps before they were finally able to flee their country. So despite them being refugees, or frankly, probably because of it, they are more American than apple pie and the Fast and Furious franchise. Because it was the US that opened its arms when my own family's homeland turned its back. So you might see me and think liberal elite. Fine, valid. But I am also a conservative refugee, also valid. Our identities, yours and mine, are a mosaic of contradictions. So instead of reducing people to some grossly oversimplified label, lean into their complexities and lean into yours. Find the overlap, because that overlap is the starting point for migration. Now, let's consider the cognitive costs of ideological migration using my grandfather as the lens. When my abuelo died in Cuba, he was a broken man. As you can see by the picture, the image does not lie. Years after his family had fled the island, he was still waging a war against the imperial West, claiming abajo con los Yankees, down with the Americans. Of course he was, because after fighting so hard in the 1950s to overthrow one dictator, Batista, in the name of another, Castro, and after so many in his generation bled on the battlefield, losing their sons and their daughters to a revolution that at the time not only felt right, it felt necessary. And then, after being inculcated with a patriotism so poisoned with resentment and radicalism that this man and people like him were taught to stop speaking with the loved ones who had fled abroad, like my mother. And he was taught to turn over to the state the loved ones who had stayed behind on the island, but who did not share his political views. That man, by the time he reached that age, had lost everything he had ever held dear for a corrupt revolution that he chose. How do you reconcile that cognitively? How do you allow yourself to consider that maybe that whole time you were wrong, or that maybe what was once right is no longer? That is a price cognitively too heavy to bear for most of us, if not all of us. So if you want to shift people from one ideology to another, assume that you know nothing about the cognitive price that that person will have to pay to consider your ideas. So that maybe when you begin your argument, you will not start with a statistic, and maybe instead you will start with a hug and some empathy. Now let's consider the social costs of ideological migration. Social suicide. We can all relate. Our politics have become so toxically intertwined with our identities that when we disagree with someone politically, we shame them, assuming they must not care about our pain or they must not share in our values, instead of asking questions to see how they arrive to their worldview. We don't all have to agree, but can we inhabit someone else's worldview long enough to understand their humanity? It is this social cost that keeps people seeking refuge inside of like-minded communities. And when we shield ourselves inside the communities with whom we share the same grievances, that is not community. That is tribalism, community's evil twin. See, community bonds over shared love with one another. Tribalism bonds over shared hate of someone else. And this is what is pushing me away from the left. Did you guys know that there is a feature on Google that has been collecting the data on the popularity of a word ever since 2006 on every single word in the internet? You did know. Okay, smarty pants in the front row. Do you know when the popularity of the word tribe peaked since the data started being collected in 2006? November of 2016. That is when the word tribe peaked on the internet. Do you guys remember what happened in November 2016? Because I sure do. And by the way, this wasn't just in the United States. Globally, the word peaked on the internet in November 2016. I think this further proves that we all in this room live in a linchpin of tribalism. And I say this as someone who, by the way, in the short term, benefits from tribalism. I am a woman, I am an Arab, I am a Latina, and I am the daughter of refugees. And yet I understand that tribalism is undeniably self-destructing, because the only shape that a tribe can take is a smaller and smaller version of itself until it ceases to exist, having excluded every possible ally from the table. It is a system where privilege, gender, and race do not intersect, but instead create a hierarchy on who gets to join the conversation and who is excluded, where the pendulum has swung so far to one side that our reaction to historical oppression is now to create more of it. Now, don't take that soundbite regarding oppression out of context. We do live in a world where people that we love have had their humanity dispossessed for generations, where people we love have had insults levied at them and racist economic policies targeting them, and where specific groups of people have been made to feel like the butt of a cosmic joke. And the work of evening out that playing field is still not over. Not until every person with the same resume has equal odds of being called for a job interview, whether they are Black or white or gay or Christian or Aboriginal. But when increasingly, the only thing we care to know about each other is what tribe we're from, Democrat, Republican, Black, white, Libertarian, whichever, we stop seeing the person. And the left does this a lot. We reduce people to the role that their people may or may not have played in historical injustices. And look, history matters, but so too does the content of a person's character. Therefore, if we are to grow this movement, we must start with a culture of compassion so that we can build a world where people feel safe to experience ideological awakenings, not just at the tender age of 22 when you are drinking bad alcohol, but again at 32 and again at 52 and even again at 92 years old. And where the bonding agent in our relationships is not the dehumanization of the political party that we have decided is inferior, but rather love. And as Arthur Brooks said, even toward our enemy. Because vitriol does not change minds, it silos. Crappy Facebook comments do not invite lefties like me to new ideological perspectives. But in a world of compassion, where we have a genuine desire to honor our shared humanity, to acknowledge someone else's pain or grievance before we address our own, in a world where a registered Democrat with an Arabic last name hailing from a Cuban refugee family can look at a room of frankly mostly white, mostly male libertarians and yet see herself in them and they in her, that is a world where community triumphs over toxic tribalism, and where the rethinking of our political framework as we grow older and wiser is not punished, but rather demanded as our civic and moral obligation. Thank you.
Left-wing politics is actually in my bloodline. My great-grandfather, Hugh de Largie, was a Labor senator in Australia's first parliament. He followed Prime Minister Billy Hughes out of the Labor Party in the conscription split of 1916. He later joined the Nationalist Party. My late parents, however, were both financiers and lifelong Liberals. I liked to rebel against my parents any way that I could, whether it was losing my virginity early, drinking underage, driving underage, experimenting with substances, or voting for Labor. As long as I was giving my parents the shits, life was okay. At 22, I packed up my suitcase in my hometown of Perth and caught a Greyhound bus over to Melbourne to pursue an acting career. At that point, I really began to form an affinity with left-wing politics, because to me, at that point in time, they represented progress. They seemed to care more about the struggle of artists and creatives. And for a young actress who was fighting against the odds, locally and internationally in London, in the competitive entertainment industry, that counted for a lot. I also had a great passion for left-wing feminism. I was born to very old parents. They had traditional family values and old school dynamics as husband and wife. Mum would wait on Dad, hand and foot, day in and day out. I found it really weird. I mean, it was as if I'd been born to Mike and Carol from the Brady Bunch. But after 11 years in Melbourne, working on various productions in theatre and film, I had a massive breakdown, which I always refer to as a breakthrough. It not only changed my life, but it changed my career path. The breakdown literally stripped me back to nothing, and I had to build myself again from scratch. To metabolise my debilitating experience, I turned to writing, and within months was being paid for my words. Don't get me wrong, I had always written. I'd written plays and films, short stories and poetry, but I'd never attempted freelance journalism. What I discovered rather quickly is that my writing gave me more than my acting ever had. I had just been not open to having writing as the main thing. I could write about social issues and politics now that were close to my heart and actually create change. I could write about my own personal experiences and help other people. Needless to say, I wrote up a storm. I wrote about my parents' deaths. I wrote about my brother's overdose. I wrote columns about the brutal rape that I endured in 1997. I wrote about my childhood sexual abuse. I wrote about abortion. I wrote about female sexuality. I wrote about domestic violence. I was a hardcore left-wing feminist writer with good intentions, and all that I wanted to do was help women. It was all going swimmingly until October 2016, when I made one error and wrote a very, very nasty column about an American celebrity. I found myself splashed across the entertainment section of the Washington Times. I ended up in Cosmopolitan magazine, The Guardian, Mashable, The Bolt Report, and many, many others. I was trolled and bullied for 3 months straight by left-wing journalists, their editors, and their minions. I wouldn't have believed that feminazis could turn against one of their sisters, but they did, with the type of vitriol you wouldn't believe. By the way, I still have screenshots of all the messages. Some of these Aussie journos and social commentators who bullied and trolled me relentlessly are fierce left-wing advocates who go on Q&A and talk about how they believe in anti-bullying. Go figure. It didn't matter that I'd written books and plays about feminist issues such as rape, DV, female sexuality. It didn't matter that I'd written nearly 1,000 columns advocating on various issues such as abuse of the elderly to childhood sexual abuse. None of that mattered to the left-wing feminists. My whole character was to be judged on one frickin' column about Kim Kardashian, which I regretted, apologised for, and learnt from. My point is, the experience of this bullying from Australian feminists, coupled with my disappointment in the left, is what drove me to take serious steps to the right. It's what forced me to rewrite my narrative. I detest political correctness. I detest any person who tries to suppress democracy. I detest not being able to talk. I detest the emasculation and degradation of men, which happens often now in our country. I detest those who attempt to police the exchange of ideas. I believe in trial by the justice system, not by social media. The truth is, I could no longer spruik the left's approved message because I no longer believed in it. The narrative in my columns changed overnight. The smokescreen had smashed. What I didn't realise is that left-wing feminist editors don't like their freelance writers to veer off path, ever. You either sell the approved message or you'll be silenced. Unable to sell the approved message, I was blacklisted and chased out of various media outlets. My ability to earn a crust as a freelance journo decreased by half, which obviously affected my ability to pay my bills, etc. But then I began to fight back. I began pitching to conservative publications, and my voice was given a platform again. I could write about what I wanted to write about without being watered down. I no longer had to change my voice in columns to adhere to left-wing political correctness or feminist ideologies. Being a non-feminist journalist in today's climate is most similar to being an outlier. It's like swimming against a collective tidal wave. Freedom of speech and freedom of expression are basic human rights that I hold very dear. I didn't like having to second-guess myself every time I opened my mouth. I didn't like having to apologise for the beliefs I held dear. The Puritans may well have taken over, but I'm a libertine. I not only need freedom for my sexual sanity and fantasies and debauchery, my mind requires freedom too. So good luck with trying to make me conform to your groupthink. Although I assumed it was 2019, I took an acid trip and it's actually 1984. Big Brother is watching. Clementine Ford is watching. Don't make a wrong move, dear. The biggest shock to me when I moved away from left-wing politics was how many friends and family members I lost. A girlfriend of 20 years told me she couldn't stomach the columns I wrote for The Spectator. So you dislike my columns. We can agree to disagree and still be friends, yeah? That's what I thought, but apparently not. I have experienced enough tragedy in my life to be victim 101, but I always try and choose the high road. One doesn't have to choose victimhood. One doesn't have to choose to hate men and boys. One doesn't have to control, to censor, to dictate, to be understood. I miss none of these things about the left. I just don't feel that I need them in my life, quite frankly. I feel that I made the right decision. The centre is where it's at. Thank you.